1/3 of creating electronic music is about sequencing. If you watch the video that I did about the triangle workflow, you'll see that there are sequencing strategies, sound source strategies, and effect strategies. And you can go really freaking deep on any part of it that you want. But this video specifically is about sequencing, and I'm just going to give you a bird's eye view of what exists in terms of sequencing methods. What do I mean by sequencing strategies? Here's 9 different sequencing strategies, and we're just going to give you a rundown of them all in a shallow way. In other videos, I can go in deeper. And no matter which strategy you use, I want you to keep the following concepts in your mind. I want you to think of the pulse. I want you to think of the syncopation, and I want you to think of the rhythmic cell. These are 3 concepts that whenever you get confused in terms of sequencing, remind yourself what you're doing in terms of these concepts, and everything's going to fall into its place. I'll do, of course, a dedicated video to these concepts, but let's get into the 9 types of sequencing. The number 1 most common way of sequencing anything in electronic music is, boom, the step sequencer. In an XOX step sequencer, you choose a sound, for example, this hi-hat sound, and you've got a grid of 16/16th notes, and it just goes back and forth, and you then choose which steps are going to be active and which are not. So for example, this clap. So the point of an XOX sequencer is 16 steps, and you just select on and off for each step. This is a great sequencing method for percussion, but also for rhythmical synths. It's called XOX because it reflects kind of how the 909 and the 808 and those Roland boxes were triggered. And that brings me to the second type of sequencing, which is 303 style sequencing. Basically the same thing with a whole bunch of steps and a timer that goes over the steps, but each step has a pitch that's usually sent to some kind of monophonic instrument. So 303 style sequencing, you could technically do it on one of these, but it would be very complicated. Maybe better to use a sequencer that's specialized in these kind of things. And so you can see we've got 16 steps. But for each step, I could choose a different note. You can absolutely do this in the piano roll as well. This is not limited to hardware. I just think it's more visually interesting. Bonus points if it can add little glides to things, because that's a very 303 style sound. So yeah, 303 style or acid style sequencers. Then the next strategy is to use polymeters and or polyrhythms. For my styles of music, I don't really use polyrhythms, I use polymeters instead. So I'll just focus on those. And polymeters are just when you use a loop that's not 1 bar long, so it doesn't evenly divide into the other loops of your track. And so you get this kind of circular, unstable, looping, kind of mathematical feeling. Imagine, for example, if I took this hi-hat line, and let's take some, like a 4 on the floor, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll add the upbeat hi-hat that we just programmed in the sequencer. Now we've got this is all very straight, right? So what if we add in something that's not a multiple of 4? So what if every 5th 16 note, one of the hi-hats was long? There we go. Notice how it feels like that hi-hat pattern is circling around the main pattern. Sometimes it's on beat, sometimes it's off beat, but there's a regularity to it that's very familiar. It can be awesome. So applying some polymeters in your music, great strategy. Another great sequencing strategy is to use Euclidean sequencers. What are Euclidean sequencers? Well, the concept is as follows. Imagine you take a loop length. Let's start with a loop of 1 bar, right? That's 16/16th notes. And you say, I want to divide that equally into 3 parts. Well, you can't actually divide 16 into 3 equal parts. They have to snap to this grid of 16ths. So you try to space out those notes as far as you can. And so then you end up with some elements that are spaced out like this. This one takes up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one takes up 5. And this one takes up 6. Imagine you instead want to divide those 16 steps by 5. Then you get something like this. And so all the different densities lead to some kind of a satisfying rhythm, especially if you juxtapose them against each other and perhaps rotate them, aka just move them around by 16th notes. Euclidean patterns are one of the fastest ways to get satisfying percussive lines, but also satisfying rhythmical ideas for synthesizers, and even more craziness happens if you don't take 16 steps, but you take less, creating another polymeter idea. So yeah, Euclidean rhythms are excellent at generating rhythmical cells. The next type of sequencing is modulation sequencing, and that's again something that the Eurorack system is really good at. You take a step sequencer, and for every step you send out a different value, and that value can, for example, change the cutoff of a filter, or change the wetness of a delay, or change whatever else you want. But you're sequencing not musical notes and not musical pitches, but instead some other factor. Now, of course, if you think of modulation sequencing and you want to apply it purely digitally, it is absolutely possible. You just kind of have to know a little bit what you're doing. Here, let's take that Euclidean sequence that I was doing before and stick it through a 707. Leads to something a little cheesy, but why not? Let's just go with it. Let's just roll with it. Okay, so this delay unit on it, what we want to do is we want to modulate, let's say, the dry wet of it. So we want to have a sequence where we set the value of the dry wet at different amounts. And so in Ableton, you could right click something and you can do show automation. That's always a good idea. So you can set your step sequence to, for example, 8th notes, and then use beat to sort of draw it in. And then make sure you loop this section. See what that's doing? It's creating some kind of interesting variation rather than me just setting a certain amount of dry wet. That could work. Or you can go back to your effect, right click it and do show modulation. That's also possible. And modulation is on the clip itself. You can draw in a looped sequence like this. And clicking and dragging is slightly less fun than twisting knobs and just using your ear, but this is definitely a good way of achieving the same idea. So modulation sequencing is incredibly powerful. And because it's a little bit under the hood in Ableton, many of you may never have even done it. But trust me if I say that many hardware synthesizer composers are using a lot of this a lot of the time. And now all of this has been fairly percussion focused, but what if you want to sequence with chords? Well, do you want to do a chord progression? That's a big one. That's a big category of sequencing ideas, right? Do you want to use 1 chord, 2 chords, 3 chords, 4 chords? You want them to be rhythmical. This is where the piano roll really shines because you have full access to whatever chords you want to program. And this video is not where I'm going to be explaining music theory and how that all works, but if you just want to do big blocks of chords and you want to program things within that, the piano roll is your tool. But remember, in electronic music more generally, you don't have to start with chords the same way that a singer-songwriter might start with chords, right? You might start more with rhythms instead. Then if you take chords to be the 6th method, then I would like to say that the 7th method is chords plus a complex arpeggiator. So you take those chords, you feed it into something like a Cthulhu. Then instead of playing these block chords like that, you could split them up using any arpeggiator. But the reason I love fancy arpeggiators like Cthulhu is that you can turn on and off various steps, creating a rhythmical cell that's more interesting than just the typical ba 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 that your usual arpeggiator just does, that like ba 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 ba. It's super fatiguing. But instead what you can do is you can draw in some kind of a pattern and even make it a polymeter, but it's always going to respect the chords that are behind it. Here, let's do a polymeter of 6 and add in some musical context. Hell yeah. So you get the benefits of a chord progression, like that emotional progression, but also that rhythmic cell of a well-designed pattern plus a little polymeter. This method really shines when you feed this into a premium synthesizer. Then the 8th sequencing strategy is to have generative sequencing, which is where you set out a set of rules for how a sequencer should behave, more or less. And then with a lot of percentage-based chances, let it sort of find its own way, where you just set the guardrails kind of, and you watch it do its thing. I was going to say this is not so much my jam, but then I thought of something. You see, inside of Fosion, there's this step sequencer. You can set random, but within a certain number of sort of preset categories, and it's going to generate a whole bunch of 303 style patterns for you. Which you can then feed into external synthesizers. And I instantly love this so much. I love that so much. Basically, anytime you're using a random button, you're kind of doing generative sequencing. But there's a whole field of really weird plugins out there that allow you to do all sorts of rule-based sequencing. It's not really my jam. But then anyway, the last method of sequencing, and many of you are just going to laugh because to many people, this is what real music is, which is, for example, on a keyboard, you know, a piano is something that is manually triggered by you. And it could be any number of tools that you are manually triggering and maybe even looping yourself triggering them so you can layer things over the top or correct them later. Basically, manually playing in instruments is a whole, well, obviously it's like all music until the last 60 years or so. So it's kind of hilarious to me that this is number 9 and almost like a footnote to electronic music. But obviously there's an infinitely deep path to figuring out how to relate to your instruments in a tactile sense. And in this case, I'm specifically thinking about playing keyboards. I'm thinking about hitting drum pads. Hoppa. There are any number of MIDI instruments out there as well, like those kind of like MIDI saxophones and all that kind of stuff. Super cool. And yeah, those performances can be recorded, looped, edit, whatever. You don't have to be classically trained or a quote-unquote real musician to be able to play around with triggering your own stuff. In fact, in a composition where everything is fully sequenced, things can sometimes feel a little too clean, and adding in some loose, organic, acoustic-based things can be just what's needed. So anyway, that's 9 sequencing strategies. Choices that you can make purely at the level of the sequencer. We haven't talked about the sound source and we haven't talked about the effects at all. I'm trying to create for you here a mind map related to the triangle workflow. And so I've made a visual image that you can print out, and it's part of the triangle series workflow. So hopefully it makes a bigger printout image later on. Are there any sequencing methods that I have left out here that aren't somehow a close cousin of what was in there? Let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to learn electronic music from the very foundations onwards, go follow my foundations course on my website. And until next time, stay producing, be good to each other, and take care. Bye bye.